Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, something of a bumper episode. My good friend, ritualist and clothing designer Katie Martin joins us from a locked-down New York. So already it's two friends catching up, and that does tend to push the old time limit on its own. But in this episode, we also have a lot of ground to cover. We obviously do a good and detailed exploration of the significance of ritual objects like masks and clothing, but we also talk about managing serious spirit perspective, overcoming anxiety, and how that relates to total healing. And as so many of those threads weave into and out of the jungle, as Katie was on the same ayahuasca dieta as me last year, there's some folds and loops in the timeline of this excellent discussion. Enjoy. Katie, welcome aboard.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one for a bunch of reasons that I think people will stumble upon as we, go through our discussion, right? But we have a non-traditional first question during these uncertain times, Katie, because you are in New York. So how are things at the moment? How are you holding up? How's the world holding up? Give us a view.
Oh man, New York is it's weird. I mean, it's kind of, I kind of, when I speak to my family members or friends that are in other locations, I can't imagine what it's like to have a car at this moment and the personal space to go grocery shopping privately, the way that you would with an automobile, like so much, because we're so condensed. It's, there are lines at the grocery store. I live in an area of Queens, and it's a little more suburban. And the local Walgreens has put up like big plastic 3-foot dividers in front of the cashiers that look like bulletproof sort of plastic. And, the little grocery shops that we go to, there's usually a line of people around the corner kind of waiting to go in because it's only like 10 people at a time. So it's, and I haven't been into the city. I haven't been into Manhattan since early March. So most of my time is spent in the house. I'm lucky that I have studio space in my house. My partner has studio space. We have enough room to give each other privacy and work on projects. And that, things are okay. I'm out of work. A lot of people are out of work. But it's a funny thing. I don't know. I think New Yorkers specifically, I miss the subway. I miss I don't know. It's a really, really strange time. Like everything's kind of condensed down to apartment living. And in a funny way, I'm sure we're going to get to this, but it's very functionally similar to my time in Italy, which was sort of reduced to like place and inside the house and kind of isolated. So it's a funny parallel, but.
Yeah. So, how does that work for exercise? Because the gyms and such are closed as well. Like, what are you doing for like physical and mental health, I guess?
Well, it's funny. Well, I've been doing a lot of sewing. I've been working in my studio, and that tends to be a bit more physical, just moving around the space. But night walks are kind of saving my life right now. So walking around, like once it's dark, when there are fewer people on the street, taking side streets, where everybody wears masks all the time, except for, a lot of people in like my neighborhood. A lot of people are kind of maybe not taking it so seriously, but going on walks, and I'm putting everything into work. Work is kind of taking a lot of my focus, and that's helping immensely. So, but not as much exercise, I think, as I should probably be doing.
Aren't we all? Oh my God, aren't we all? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's. I was joking about it. I had a gym in London, right, but didn't join a gym until the beginning of this year, having been back in Australia about 3 or so years now. And I joined a gym, and then 2 weeks later, this happens, and it's sort of I can't make this up. It's sort of I regularly go to the gym for 2 weeks. I'm like, nah, this is coming along nice, and now no,
No, I should be. I keep looking into like Pilates or yoga, courses that I can do online, but I'm just not doing it. I'm taking a lot of baths instead and calling that exercise. That seems to be working.
Yeah, nice one. It's it's funny. There's a I look at it in a weird economic way at the moment, so that everything, especially I live at the edge of the world, so whenever there's a long supply chain that can be disrupted literally anywhere between like me and northern China with a lot of stuff. So there are just things that we can't get, and it's been very interesting sort of doing our infrastructure build over the winter, or heading into winter here, that there's stuff that we can and can't get. And it's funny, like, so there's an impact in productivity of it, of the fact that there are just disruptions everywhere, and the things that I've wanted to be able to do, I haven't been able to get to at the speed I ordinarily would have been able to, right? But it's funny, there's a psychological component to it as well, where I think there's a psychological impact on productivity. So if baths are part of it, you can actually say, look at me being productive, because there just seems to be difficulties for a lot of people. And I'm leading it up to a question for you. There seems to be difficulty for a lot of people in remaining focused, and there's all this challenging discourse around like coming out of isolation, having learned Spanish or something, and it's not quite that, but I'm struggling on a creative basis to hit the level I ordinarily would. And I wonder if some of that is I derive in an extrovert way enrichment from just being out and about. Like I would write blog posts or plan things in a pub or a cafe in town and things that like I can't get to now. But your experience, at least so far, you kind of had like the exemplar negative impact of the isolations and house arrests and so on, but also quite a positive story to it as well. So do we like talk us through that? Because it's been an interesting couple of months for you for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah, it's so the first I have spent the last 3 years working in a boutique in Manhattan. It's a higher end boutique. We sold primarily Japanese and European designers, and there was a lot of hand-dyed work, kind of art garments, avant-garde fashion, luxury price points, and I loved it. I've been there. I was there for 3.5 years, and I was making a transition. I spent most of from late January to March 9th specifically, working 2 jobs. And I was going to transition to working for a creative agency, a small creative agency, and do some studio management and like working with archives, working with artists. I was really excited because it was just a whole different skill set. And I was really sad to leave the shop, but I was having some issues with the industry as a whole and my role in it. And like everybody else, like once the coronavirus thing started kicking up, right, like the next day, March 10th, I was supposed to start full time at the creative agency, but the owner had some financial conversations and it just wasn't feasible to take somebody on. So I've basically been in my house since then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been in the store. It's beautiful. But you were transitioning jobs. You had one to go to and then obviously didn't because of what's going on. So you've lost 2 jobs during this current situation, which is actually kind of impressive, really. I mean, you'd left one of them, but most people just lose one when these things happen. But you kind of fell through an interesting gap there, and that's the I don't want to say negative, but it's sort of like the exemplar shock experience of this situation. But you also have the exemplar kind of like positive experience, I guess. Talk us through that.
Yeah, there was, so the first phase, like from working the 2 jobs, I was exhausted because it's New York and there's like a 2-hour daily commute minimum. And I was spending every day off at the new job. So when this was ramping up and I found out I kind of lost both jobs, like I definitely spent at least 2 weeks doing a whole lot of nothing. And it was incredible. It's just like, fuck all. And then maybe a week or like 10 days. And then it started getting pretty serious, and people were, there were all these kind of calls for personal protective equipment and a lack of it. And I remember I was like in my studio, and I have a 1949 FAF, which is a big industrial leatherworking round arm machine. But I have a big industrial machine. And I remember looking around and saying, like, I have time, I have ability, I have literally a wall of scrap fiber and an industrial machine. Like, this is my only Superman moment that I'm ever going to get. This is the only time that what I do happens to be useful to a broad number of people. So I sat down and I made about 60 masks and passed them out in the neighborhood, mostly to like bodega workers, my laundromat, grocery workers, people that didn't have a choice about going home or interacting with the public, whereas I did. And then a friend of mine has a record label, and he had a bunch of old band merch, t-shirts. So I made 111 masks with that material. And then they went out with all of his orders. And then like that was, right around 200 masks. I made some more and like done, and after that, I just sort of pivoted towards my own business, starting a business that I've kind of been waiting for enough time, because construction is such a time consuming craft. It's very labor intensive. It takes a lot. I mean, everything takes a lot of hours, but I just pivoted to that, and I've been putting everything into that. So
so we chatted about this. We had chatted about this at length before. It's interesting living in a major city like London or New York, because everyone has the job, the gym, which we just mentioned, some form of, I hate the term side hustle, because I'm not sure that's fair, especially when it's a creative thing. So for me, it was writing. For you, it was, or is this, right? So when you talk about having 2 jobs, you had 2 jobs and you also had your like form of expression in like a fashion context, and life is crazy. Like when we were messaging to arrange this call, I have vivid memories of basically going on holiday to blog, right? Because there just isn't enough time when you're socializing, having jobs, commuting, doing all the kind of like city stuff, means that there are just there just isn't enough fragments of time to string together to sort of do a project. So this is your instance of getting those fragments of time strung together, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a weird pocket. It's a weird pocket that, I was going to say that I'm not going to get back. I don't even know if I hope that's true. I mean, it's definitely taught me, I've had a lot of experience, like sewing. Essentially the way that I do it is, and it's done in isolation. Hardly any of my friends have seen me physically do the work that I do. And like you were saying, you can go to a pub, or you would, do it kind of out in the world and around other people, but I'm always isolated when I work, and I always end up doing it at like 2 a.m. or something. And so it doesn't feel bad for me. It just feels like a whole lot of freedom at the moment, like a pocket of time. And I think like I don't know, like I keep thinking of this, I love this phrase from Game of Thrones, but using chaos as a ladder, like it's such an incredible idea. And, not everybody has the access or ability to do so, but I have all the components to use this moment as a ladder. I have all the components, the time and ability, and to really, I don't know, like grow something. Because in these moments of big disruption, in the tower card moments that you have in your life, that's the most fertile soil that you'll ever get. And this, in our lifetime, this is era-defining history, right? you have those personal moments of massive disruption, like when you left London, and we've talked about this too, like relocating to another country and how you can reform so many elements of your life. And this is a global version of that.
Everyone
and
gets this. Like
everyone gets
we
this.
moved, but everyone gets this.
Yeah. And this is something we won't live through era defining astrology or historical events again. So this is without question the most fertile soil that we're ever going to get our hands in. I mean, this is the most ripe with possibility. And I've been through enough like experiences of personal disruption to know that, you know, if I really stick my hands into the soil right now, I can use this. And so that's my hope.
Yeah. And funny, you mentioned soil and kind of like time. So we're going to get to the traditional first question in a moment, but it's important to realize that it's not just the, whatever you think the corona situation is, it's not just that's impacting it. What you're doing now is in fact, that's an extension or a sequence of events that includes, because people don't know this, but we'll talk about it. You were on the jungle dieta with me last year and so on.
Yep.
So this is tied in with everything, right? And so we're going to have that discussion, but to have that discussion, and I know some of this for some weird ways, but, but Katie, were you a weird kid?
Yeah. I was born in New Orleans. I grew up in Alabama, which is on the Gulf Coast. I grew up in a very rural part, and I grew up next to a giant hole in the ground where the city actually mined red clay. Alabama is very famous for iron-rich, like kind of dense red clay. It's about 6 inches below the topsoil, and there was just a big ass hole in the ground in the middle of a field where they would, use bulldozers and mine it. And that's where I played as a kid. I definitely believed that the trees in my backyard were alive, and still hold those beliefs, obviously. But it was, I spent a lot of time picking blackberries and like just running around kind of out in the woods, out in fields, chasing snakes. We always had big dogs, and like running around with dogs. And it just a ton of my mom always said I was a little bit spooky as a kid, and was definitely reading when I was younger, like 10 or so. She would let us go to the library, and so long as we read every book that we took out, we could take out as many, my sister and I would take out as many as we wanted. So I just decimated like all the books on ESP and UFOs, astral projection, and got into that at a really young age. And just all your sort of normal spending time alone in the woods, like talking to trees. And
do any of those books stand out for good and bad reasons? Because there are some, and I collect them, but there are some like shockingly terrible 70s paperback ESP mind power type stuff that I love now. But like, is there any that you remember that like, yeah, I should build like nested pyramids out of wood and lie under them? Like anything stand out to you? What were the kind of early magic sci books that impacted you think? Don't have to be at the age of 10 either. Like we can jump forward in the timeline.
It was, I was really into astral projection, reading about it. And I had weird dreams for a little kid. Really, really weird dreams. And it could be, the early 80s and all the 80s was a really great time for like high fantasy. So Dark Crystal and Clash of the Titans. And so you had monstrousness and the other, and fantasy and monsters specifically were kind of in our social psyche, like collective visual psyche. And my father loved horror. I saw Alien in my mom's stomach in the theater. And I remember seeing Conan the Barbarian when I was about 5. The one with the thing with the horn on the forehead at the end, I don't remember. Or that may have been Red Sonja.
No,
But anyway,
that's Destroyer. I think that's a Conan. That's Conan the Destroyer. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It's like a sacrificial, it's something happening at the
I
end.
remember that. I remember the film. I watched it as a too young kid myself, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So but like having dreams about flying over a series of islands with like disfigured, like cyclopses, things like that, and understanding that, like knowing that it was called the Land of Nod, but I don't know if that was. I think that's in the Bible. I still haven't. I researched it a long time ago and then like left it. But the things like that, I had a lot of visions, and I had a lot of like dreams are still really intense for me and have nothing to do with my daily life. And they usually picked up, like it was picking up a story. I had a sequence dream, I think in high school, that went on for 6 or 8 months, where I would just go back almost every night to the same narrative or storyline. It's always like questing and journeying, stuff like that. But a lot of, I remember testing myself. What were the cards? The ESP cards, where you have the,
Xena cards, or Xena cards. Yeah.
And doing that by myself as like a kid, reading a lot of, we talked about abduction stuff, I think a bit. And like was it Unsolved Mysteries, I think played a big role. Did you had that series? Did you watch that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But I think that stands out, like a lot of the Xena cards you said. Trying to develop those skills and trying to not necessarily read minds, but see, like sort of anticipate or see or like develop sensitivities in a way. Yeah.
Cool. It's interesting that so that interest was there, or that that upwelling of you as that kind of thing was there from the sort of beginning, because we spoke about it. You started telling me about the Alabama clay when we were driving through the jungle to get to the like the, what do we call it? The camp, I guess, but the place where we spent the river, because the soil there was a similar kind of red, right? Which I thought was kind of interesting. So you had like a psi and an animist thing going on. Were there any, do you have any sort of standout experiences that, other than the dreams, which we resonate on, anything else? Like did you accidentally and to your own satisfaction read someone's mind after all this like amateur paranormal research?
You know, funny you should ask that. Actually, I was bitten by one of our German shepherds. So I was walking down the hall on all fours, and he was coming towards me, King. He was walking, and I was at the same height, and I remember throwing my arms around him to hug him around the neck, and I hugged too tightly because I was a child, 10 years old, and his mouth was next to my left eye, and he nipped at me, and the skin popped open like a grape and spread pretty big. It was, I start crying because I'm little. Dad takes a dog outside, almost shoots it, doesn't. I have to go to the hospital and get stitches, and I sort of demanded, they started the stitches. My mom fainted watching it, and I demanded that the doctors wait until they revived her and put her in a gurney next to me. But I remember that moment specifically is when I became interested in nonverbal communication and animal communication specifically. And there was a point years ago, basically all growing up, I thought I was going to work with animals, like either as a veterinarian or a biologist or something. I don't have the hard science skills to do so, but any kind of communication with body language, with posture, all of that, when you're reading any animal's body language, you're paying micro attention to shifts in communication that's not native to you. And that and I think maybe some latent empath abilities really kind of solidified a lot of interests that have carried through for the rest of my life. And that absolutely carried over into fashion and clothing and the communication that garments provide, because you get like in a city like this, you get from your home to work and you've already talked to 100 people if you don't even open your mouth. You've talked with your posture and your body and how tired you look, and if you accidentally or don't make eye contact, all of it's communication. And I think that started then when I was a kid. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. So how do we, because you said you didn't have the hard science thing, but you assumed end up working with animals. And arguably, when you're working with leather and things, it is there in a wider context, right? So how do we tell the next bit, like the vintage bit to Italy, I guess?
Let's do that quick. So I moved when I was about 20 to Denver. I spent 9 years in Denver, got married to kind of a high school sweetheart, and he joined the Army, so we joined the Army. So the next 11 years I was a military spouse, which was its own interesting experience. And that was a lot of moving, that was a lot of time alone as well, and isolation, because there was the deployment, and then there was also anytime my ex-husband would need to go for training one place or another, I was kind of at the house, and we had 2 dogs at the time. So I was usually, manning the fort, so to speak. And I spent my Saturn return learning how to sew. So all of my time in Denver was I worked in like a record store, but I worked in vintage shops and secondhand stores. And those were still to this day some of my favorite jobs. First time I walked into an actual vintage store, because we didn't have them where I grew up. I still remember it. I remember how it smelled. I remember how the light looked. It was one of those sort of capital P place experiences, and it just imprinted pretty hard. That the secondhand, the infinite variety. So part of working in the secondhand job was buying from the public. It was like a Beacon's Closet, Buffalo Exchange situation. And so you're going through clothing every single day, and you're assessing the garments. You're looking at age, you're looking at condition, you're looking at provenance, you're training yourself to be able to identify the material, the composition, how worn it is in a matter of minutes, which is incredible. What an education. So that was Denver, lived at Fort Knox, went to Savannah. And then while I was living outside of Savannah, I went to Georgia Southern for my degree. They had a very small fashion design program. It was in the hospital, or the hospitality program. It's not like, you have FIT and Parsons, a lot of the bigger fashion schools, and you only do draping and cutting, and you work on a thesis, and you only do fashion for like 4 years. But this was a college. So I had to take statistics and, elementary biology and things like that. And it was kind of like my major program. But I did my degree at 30, and I spent my Saturn return learning how to sew. And the first time I did a gather, which is a really simple stitch that you kind of like pull the thread, and it creates a gather at the top, and that's how you get a full skirt. That was another like capital P place. That was like a moment of my galaxy brain moment, I guess. And having studied looking at composition, and then being really, really interested in vintage, which bleeds into costume history. That dovetailed nicely, learning how to actually construct the garments. And I had 2 professors that had PhDs in costume history. And I didn't have time to finish a major program and a minor before I left, before the next PCS with the military. So I did like a 4-year program in 3.5 years with a 3-hour daily commute. And I was full up on courses every semester and blah, blah, blah. But that got me, so I finished the degree. I did kind of some minor classes in costume history with the professors. Then we moved to Italy. That was our last duty station. And then I was there for 4 years, and that was
all kinds of stuff.
all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
We first met when you were living in Italy, but I think it's a good time to jump in because I see it obviously, but it's worth discussing, and it's almost like a trick question. So it's self-evident to me that someone who kind of had an animist childhood can understand that some objects are people, or that clothing can have a story and a life cycle with multiple humans and multiple lives and so on. Like, the vintage is exciting because most of it is shit, but some of it is like, most of it is cast-offs, right? But some of it is like things that are like, they have a life, they literally outlast their owners in the majority of cases, right? So they have all these different lives, and they're off on their own missions. So there's something fascinating and magical object-y about vintage when it's done right. So here's a almost like deliberately trick question. What is the difference between a costume and a ritual garment? Because that's one of the things that you specialize in. And so what's the difference between a costume, knowing that from an historical perspective, and a ritual garment? Is there one? Like, how do you see that?
That's a great question. Costume is, in costume history, it's an identifiable set of garments that give you a ready-made identity. So if you can dress as it for Halloween, if it's recognizable, I can wear a fireman's costume because this cut of jacket plus this cut of pants tells the viewer that this is what I do. So this collection of garments has a name, it has an identity, it has a culturally accepted or recognizable identity. Costuming, though, is making something. Oh God,
it's tough, isn't it?
What an unfair question.
It's funny. You maybe accidentally, because I just picked up on something you said there, which is kind of cool, which is that a costume tells the viewer something. Now, there might be a kind of like $10 word tricksy way of sliding that into ritual by saying that ritual garments also do that, but the viewers in this case may be spirits, maybe what have you, because it's funny, like, you go far enough back and go, cool, so I'm telling the viewer that on Halloween night I'm a fireman, right? But that is performatively identical to going back 100,000 years and putting a mask on around the fire. Like, it's the same, because you're telling viewers, okay, now I am an ancestor, now I am like the now I'm spirits from the sun or whatever. And you think, hang on a minute, this is why I asked the question, and it is mean. What the fuck is the difference between a costume and a ritual garment?
I think it is I think you're exactly right, and it's it always depends on who the audience is, but your audience is God, your audience is spirit, your audience is ancestors. You are, in either case, you are putting on a collection of garments or a collection of things that tell somebody else, like, I need you to recognize me in this way. I need you to see that if I am not this thing in daily life, I represent this thing today on this stage. Next to this campfire, in front of this group. It's why every like religious leader is identifiable, regardless of what they do. There's something that if they are standing in front of any group, they're going to, if we go back to the jungle, we will know which person the shaman is. You know what I mean? Like, there's something that is dawned that says that I'm here to do this work. And it is a designation of work. It is a designation of also responsibility. I'm here to represent these ideas or to show you something and to engage in a ritual. And it is like all performance is ritual anyway too, right?
Exactly. Well, I think that's the key. Like, the reason I wanted to ask the question that way is for people listening to sit with how you personally, if you can notice a distinction between costuming and ritual, then I put it humbly to you, you've got one of those ideas wrong, right? So we did this in the Journeying course, where we sort of looked at Dr. Jack Hunter's research and on how in a Western context, we understand words like performance as a falsehood, but
Yeah.
actually in spirit-based context. So that was, I believe, in relation to Cuban Espiritismo and Santeria and those kind of things, that when states of possession and wearing different garbs and being in that was not a falsehood, but like a flowing through of truth. And so that kind of gets, that's why if people sit with, well, how is costuming different? And it is because it comes back to that kind of theory of mind idea, because we know this from Eduardo Cohn's research and all the rest of it, that you are kind of, as a self, you are relationally composed by the perspectives of others seeing you. So that's one of the reasons there are taboos around looking at things and not looking at things. In Aboriginal Australia, there are reasons you don't show images of people who have passed and what have you, because you kind of, it's almost like you accidentally and violently bring part of them back from the dead by looking at them in their human form when they're no longer in it, right? So there's this whole language of who is looking at what, and relationality and perspective that is underpinning. And it's, you kind of have to jump down and do the work on a personal basis to go, well, what do I think goes on there? And I think it's a good trick question to say, well, what do you think the difference between a costume and a ritual garment is? Because that almost forces into one's mind, like, well, what is the difference? And so what's a performance? What is, and so on. And I think that's really exciting. You've had, when you look back, because we've had long discussions about this, sitting in a river in the jungle, but you look back in your life, and this is coming back to Italy now, you got the components to have this remarkable and kind of like talented exploration of these sort of areas, almost out of sequence. Because the Italy thing, you have an Italian background, right? And it was never something you thought was going to happen. And all of a sudden, we're on ancestral lands, don't speak the language, in some sort of weird, much of it language-based isolation again, which is a funny thing. So tell us what, I mean, that's a strange thing to go through, I think.
It was, and it was, I mean, I think as an American specifically, it was the thing, the event that maybe brought me, because the period previous to that, I just had my head down, right? I was in school the entire time and just hustling to get through, to finish so that I could relocate, with my husband at the same time. And then with Italy, like, I mean, it was incredible. Like, my mom was obviously really excited. My mom is Sicilian. And so, to be able to go and see the where we came from at some point. But I did learn, I didn't have quite enough lead in time to learn the language before you go. And you never really get it right until you go anyway. But moving there with the military was the first time. So I wasn't just there as an American. I was there as an American spouse of a military member, and there's a military base in Italy. And it was, I was part of a local population. I was living among the local population. There were maybe 500 people in the town where my house was. It was tiny, mostly pensioners, and 2 churches, 2 graveyards, like 1 grocery store. And so you're confronted with all of your roles and all of what you represent to everybody around you, in a way that I don't think a lot of Americans, I didn't, a way that you just can't and don't. You kind of start to see the global opinion of Americans, of the American military, of foreign policy, and understand that you, as an individual, cannot be divorced from those, what you represent. And that makes you hypersensitive to how you're received in public. That makes you hypersensitive again to when you don't speak the language, and when your spouse is, very, very, very busy. You're kind of alone in this community for 4 years, with no one really to talk to. And you can't make, or I didn't find it easy to make really solid relationships with the locals. Just like the language barrier was there, and it was very, very real. It's not like a major city like London or Paris where everyone speaks English. A lot of people did, but a whole lot of people don't. And Italian it's actually a really difficult language. and they love dialect. It's like every 30 kilometers, there's a different dialect and a different intonation. And when I, after a couple of years of living there, traveled down to Sicily and tried to use the Italian that at that point had gotten pretty good, useless, almost entirely useless. So it was a really funny kind of isolation, a really funny kind of experience, to lean into self-reliance. But that tied back to growing up, like way out in a rural area. We're 30, 45 minutes from a store. So if you are 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes, but there's no corner store. There's no like running somewhere quickly to get anything. If you can't communicate with somebody at the store, if you're geographically distant, and I know that this is, we've talked about this too. This is what your situation is like. You just use what you have around you. Like, that's it. When you're in an isolated situation like this, like with quarantine, like you really test your resilience, and it's a nice exercise. It's a good thing to get good at, I think.
Yeah. So it was in Italy. This is kind of the same question. The kid who was interested in xenocards and astral projection and dreams and so on was also there. There might have been, even if it wasn't verbalized, that kind of awareness of ritual garments and so on. But like, how did you find the show? How did you find the blog? Because this is where you found me this lifetime anyway.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I just figured this out last week. I was Googling images, I think, of Aubrey Beardsley for something. And Spare came up, Austin Osman Spare. And somewhere like within the first or second page of the search hit was a Rune Soup post about a Spare show that you saw in London. And then somewhere, I think in the same blog post, you mentioned, or no, I think that was much earlier. So I found you, and then I started reading it, and that's when I came back. That was a very another like felt like place that brought me all the way back to being a kid. It felt deeply familiar. Your voice was deeply familiar, which we'll get to later, and then later, which I think today is the anniversary, actually.
Really?
Yeah, of the conference.
It was about this time, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, because I think Vanessa just posted about it, but it was Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult. Sometime after that Spare post, and I can't remember if it was a year or 3 months or whatever, you posted about going to this conference that was put on by Carl Abramson and Vanessa Sinclair. And I was a baby novice in this whole arena. Didn't think and knew I was coming also as a military spouse, and didn't know how that would be received. But I saw it. It was on a new moon. It was like 3-4 days after my birthday. Tickets, Ryanair tickets from Italy to London were cheap. I said, fuck it. And I went by myself. Didn't know anyone. And I ended up coming home with a suitcase full of books. Everybody gave me books. I met you and Peter and Alkistis, Robert from Folger, God, just so many people. Carl, Vanessa. I'm not going to sit and list everybody, but that kind of cracked the floodgates open, and that was a deep sense of coming home and of like familiarity and recognition, and also place. And it was, I think, the first time in many, many years where I felt situated. And at that point, I think I'd started reading all of your sigil stuff on the website before I came. But yeah, that's how I found you on the internet. And then that's where we met in person.
Yeah. We'll talk about, that was kind of a big deal for you.
Yes.
To do that. Actually, give us that bit first, and then I'll tell you my side of that as well. The other big part of it was I was having a lot of health issues. My father passed away about a month before I moved to Italy, so I was doing a lot of grieving away from my family and friends and community, and
And that coupled with the language barrier and sense of isolation, and I also, and I want to say this, I wasn't allowed to work for money. The visa situation as an auxiliary to the military meant that I couldn't take a job from a local, which I agree with, but I was, kind of without a rudder. And so I was having rolling panic attacks for years. And what was happening at that point, I would leave the house, I'd have a panic attack while driving, and I would have to pull over and finish it and cry and sob and before I could move on. Or I would get on a train and like you're in this country and you're never going to have this opportunity again. So I'd get on the train, go to a city and just struggle with a panic attack the entire time, like shaking and crying, get off the train, have a coffee, and then get right back on and go home. And that would be a success for the day. Right. And the same thing, when I'd gone to London, when I went to that, for years after that too, like I stood outside for a good 30 to 45 minutes and just like kind of shook and cried in the alleyway, to be able to go inside. And I was very awkward at that time. Not that I'm not now, but it was worse. And, I had to work through, but I went anyway. Like I just like, fuck you, have your panic attack, stand in the alley, and then go in and then talk to people. And that continued for a while, but that was.
Yeah. Like I only got that part of it when we were in the jungle, so I have a couple of distinct memories, which I think are interesting and to some extent adorable. But I remember in there, you kind of stood up from the chair the first time we spoke, and you said words to the effect of like, I promised myself I wouldn't leave without talking to you. I promised myself I would come and talk to you or whatever. And you kind of stood up and wrapped whatever, because you've always obviously fashion people, very glamorous, wrapped this thing around you as you walked towards me. And I'm like, this is interesting. So we started chatting, right? And that was good because we had a good chat, and then we went to the after drinks with Peter and Alkistis. And one of my moments, because this is the reward. That's why I wanted to have the anxiety discussion first, is we're all sitting there and drinking, and you were saying, like, telling us what you do in northern Italy. And he said, I'm not even sure if I'm a witch or how that works. And Alkistis and I both kind of said, listen, if you come to things like this and are doing dream work and you're working with leather and dead animals in like a properly sensitive way, we've got news for you. And I remember Alkistis, yeah, this is that's literally what it looks like. And I remember that it's kind of like you returned with, even if that's not an identification for it now, there is a process there that meant that you kind of came back with I guess so. I guess there's a way. I don't know if that happened in your head, but I remember watching your face at the table in the pub when Alkis just kind of said that, and we'll come back to her in a minute because you guys have done some work together. But I thought that was it was a really interesting moment. And the other one, and we'll come back to it in the jungle. We had a few drinks. We were both smoking at the time, so we were sitting out the front of the pub. And you're like, it's weird. I feel like I know you. This is stuff you were saying to me. I feel like I know you. Your voice is so familiar. I feel like we grew up together, but obviously we didn't. And I'm there sort of drinking and smoking, going, well, this Katie person's fun, but this is a bit weird. where are we going with this? But anyway, we will come back to that once we get to the jungle. But unless we want to do that now, because I have the next step was about ritual garments and what have you. But no, let's do it now.
Yeah.
Why did you come to Peru?
So I just turned 30 or 40. I'm trying to cut that one off. Damn it. A few days ago, and my 39th year. So my last year was all a health year for me. It had been on my list to do ayahuasca. And I was kind of like, putting it out there and like doing work around it, and it'll come when it comes. And the year started in March. It's kind of normal. And in March, my partner and I did a photo shoot with Melanie Gatos, who is she's a pretty famous model. She works with Tim Walker a bit. She has a disability. She has ectodermal dysplasia and is legally blind and has a non-traditional beauty but she's, and it was important to me to work with, and it still is important to work with people that are giving and showing different aspects of inhabiting a body. And I'll say more about that too. That's incredibly important to me. And so it was a really big honor for me to work with her. And there was a stylist that connected us, and he had seen some of he was like, "Do you have anything you haven't shot?" And I was like, "Well, I have these 12-foot garments that I made for, a thing that Charlotte Rogers did in Bath." And so I pulled those out, and we made something else. Anyway, we shot it, and I was really excited. But at that point, I'd been having some symptoms. I was kind of monitoring. And like the next day, I went to a doctor who referred me to an oncologist because I had lymph nodes that were hard and not painful in my groin. Turns out that's not a good sign. So the oncologist, it was like a 6-week turnaround from you're fine and you're smoking constantly to we did a couple of different biopsies. There was a needle biopsy, there was a transabdominal ultrasound, and then I ended up having surgery to have one removed. And I had like 3 cancer cells. They were lymphoma, but they're not, I don't have cancer, and I didn't have cancer. They lacked the final mutation to become malignant. But I went through this roller coaster of about 6 weeks of like, okay, well, this test came back this way, this test came back this way. We want to go ahead and do this. We want to go ahead and do this. And I've talked to other people that have dealt with lymphoma, and their journey was like 10 months to a year, waiting for doctors. This happened rapidly. So I had the surgery, found out I was fine. There's a really funny story about that. Like I had the day I got the diagnosis, this is high weird, so I'll talk about it. The day I found out that I didn't have cancer, I was in the hospital, and a friend of mine is in a relationship with Mitch Horowitz, and he gave me a figurine for a doctor. And I'm forgetting the name right now, and I'm going to kick myself later, but he gave me the figurine. He gave me a copy of his book and an oil and just support materials. So I blessed the figurine, brought it with me to the oncologist's office. And they come in and they ask me something, and I'm just like praying as hard as I can. Like, and at this point I'm like, just make it curable. I'll go through whatever. I don't want the kind that is incurable. Like that's my big wish. The nurse comes in and says, do you have a tattoo? And I'm like, I'm crying. I'm expecting news. And I like look at her and I'm like, yeah. And she's like, is it big? And I'm like, yeah, it's my whole back. And she's like, is it black? And I'm like, it is actually. And she's like, okay, we'll be right back, and leaves again, which was cruel. But the doctor comes in a few minutes later, and it turns out that this tattoo that I got before the conference, which I should mention, this tattoo that I got I had an allergy, and your lymphocytes, my lymphocytes did their job. They detected my lymph nodes. Anybody with a lot of black work is going to have black ink in their lymph nodes. They just don't know it. A couple of lymphocytes went bad, and they turned to lymphoma cells. My lymph nodes did their job, isolated them from the body, and held them there. And that's what they found when they did the biopsy. So it was out of any percentage of, because lymph nodes are like grapes under the skin, right? They just happened to take out one that had the cells in it to recognize them. And I could have 1 or 2 cells somewhere else in the body, but I don't have cancer. Somewhere in that time when I was going to all these doctor's visits, I got an email from you, a member's email, that said, there's some open spots for an ayahuasca trip to Peru. And I remember like almost throwing my phone. Like, you are kidding. Gordon and I at this point have ended up at 2 different conferences together. We have like funny synchronicity. Now there's this thing I want to do, and he's a part of it. And I trust, like if I'm going to do it, it's going to be what's coming from this source. But I may be in chemotherapy at that point. Like a week or 2 later, I got the all clear, and I just could not throw money at the event fast enough. And I was there 1 month later, So that was early June, I think we went. And that's what brought me there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing. You also, in addition to seeing doctors, I remember you telling me in the jungle that you got a bunch of tarot readings and so on as you do, and some of them are quite like, oh, I don't see cancer in this reading, which is cool. Like there's some good people out there throwing some cards in New York.
Yeah, it actually, this was incredible. Like it's a guy named Mickey Pellerano here. He's a really incredible artist and astrologer, and he does tarot. And I remember it was like the Two of Pentacles, but it looked like a yin yang, and it was in my root chakra. And he was like, "Are you pregnant? Are you trying to become pregnant? Like this, what I'm seeing is like, it was like a white cell and a black cell." And he was like, I see germination. And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, actually, all this is going on with my health. Do you think that's cancer?" And he was like, "No, I don't see that." And now with the benefit of hindsight, it's not. It was good and bad cells in the same area.
Yeah.
They were both present, but it's, that's pretty neat.
It's your Peru arrival story was definitely magical. We'll come back to, because it's now we're in the jungle, right? You picked for people who don't know the structures that we stay in, because each person who's on dieta gets one. It's called a tambo, and it's just like a covered platform with a bed on it, basically. And you picked one that was closest to one of the more trafficked path to the river. So you had a lovely view of the river, but you also had what passes for high traffic.
It's true.
Super interesting. But I remember it was the first day or so. And you said something, because there's things about your life that need to be interpreted magically. And it's a sense of it's the isolation thing and also being moved around the board. So even though you just kind of like arrived in Peru after going through a sort of serious like scare, right? You said something which I think is really good and wise, and I think it's the right attitude to come out of an experience like that with, which is I'm not ready to go yet, and that was really it's a really interesting wake-up call. I think it's part of one of the things that ayahuasca has provided to you over the course of it. But it was really interesting to see, for a bunch of reasons we're about to get to, like child Katie coming back too, because you had a tarantula in your tambo. And by the end of the dieta, it's like, whatever. Like, giant scary spider, but it's not scary. Like I had snake, slithering past my tambo, and you go, fair enough. Like it's really interesting to kind of be in that environment. But so, I mean, it was a lot to talk about. I remember because we had not necessarily lost touch, but we hadn't been in communication very much. So you've done some work with Arkistis, and you guys are friends. So I messaged Arkistis while I'm in Lima, going like, "What's going on with Katie? Catch me up." She said like, "Moved to New York, divorce, cancer scare." And I'm like, "Okay, stop catching me." We're like, there's going to be a lot to go through, and it certainly was. But like, what was your first impression, maybe when we got to, or no, just in general, like what was the thing that because we saw each other in the line at Lima airport, waiting to get on the flight to, and that's where we did our catching up, waiting to get on the flight to Pucallpa, which is another city in Peru, and from there we went on our journey, right? But like, did you know when you landed? For me, I got to tell you this bit, but for me, when I landed in Lima, because I got there a week and a bit before, I'm like, I felt at home. I felt Pachamama. I felt like Peru is important to me. And I was messaging James over the course of that week going, I think I'm a South America guy now. I think I'm one of those like white people with the sort of Inca hats. I think this is in my future. But I mean, I make a joke about it. However, even in the grossness that is Lima Airport and surrounds, I'm like, this is really important to me. I don't know if it was. I get that through the feet when I land somewhere. I don't know if it was that for you.
It's not the feet, but yeah, without question. But I think it was also because that coming back to any of this practice as an adult was through you. And then like I met you at the conference in London. And then again, there was another, like a 2-day thing that you and Alkistis and Peter all spoke at. It was a smaller occult conference. I don't remember what it was, but
London Occult Conference. That was the one just before I left, wasn't it?
yes, yeah. That was we all collected in the Airbnb. Yeah,
That was
yeah. And that was so that was the first one. You were kind of this point of ingress, and then I saw you there, and you were on your way leaving to leave London to move to Australia, and I was getting ready to leave Italy to go back to the States, and so we were talking about that, so that there were those parallels. So running into you at the airport. I felt it on the plane, or I think like the lead up to it, just knowing what was coming was like this. I already feel a sense of correctness and rightness. And I'm a dumb animal. My Mercury is in Taurus. So like, I feel before I articulate, and that I knew it was correct. And when I remember seeing you, and it was like, oh, there he is, just like okay, now we've taken our finger off pause. Does that?
Yeah, definitely. So we were there for whatever it was, a couple of weeks, right? And in the Maloka, which is the area where you actually do the ceremonies, you learn a lot about someone by lying next to them for a couple of weeks of ayahuasca ceremonies. And we did everyone kind of got their own sort of spots. Creatures of habit, humans do that, right? And so it was, you were on my right the entire time. During ceremonies. And so I think you learn a lot, and we're going to get to, this is a really challenging thing, and I'm glad it's you. We were talking about it before we hit record, but there are things you go to the jungle for. And I think part of that, I mean, tell people what that was for you, because we're talking a year later, and its flow and effects for the things that I went for and for the things you went for are still in play and are happening and have arrived in our lives for unusual reasons. But why did you? We sort of got the why did you go in the sense of like, fuck it. This is something I always wanted to do. Gordon and I have got some weird business going on, and I've just come out of this trauma thing. So yes, damn hell, I am going to do ayahuasca in its traditional context. But was this specifically because we actually had to sit down individually with the shaman and explain what it was we came from a healing perspective to do, right? So is there any of that kind of thing you want to share?
Yeah, it was, a lot of it was mental health stuff, like the depression and anxiety, healing from, I think, a lot of the bigger traumas. A month was nowhere. I didn't even remotely start to process the cancer scare. In the month it took for like me to get an okay diagnosis to hit the jungle, it was just sort of like, there was a moment in the middle of all the testing where I remember sitting in the bathtub, like sitting in the shower on the floor. And I remember looking at my body, and I was thinking about what could potentially happen if I went through chemotherapy. And I've been, discussing with my partner, like, what, like how that would affect our lives. And, my honestly, losing my fingernails scared the shit out of me, because I work with my hands and things like that. And I remember looking at my body and like the shape of my body, being the age that I am. And I remember like apologizing to it because I policed it so hard as a woman, like, or as a human, like we all end up doing, but looking and sort of saying like, I cared whether or not there were veins visible on my leg. And now I may lose the whole thing. And I spent so many hours focused on this idea of self, focused on this very polished, or very presented, or very, I can't think of an articulate way of saying it, but just like a version of a woman that fit into society in all the correct ways, like that you're taught from part of the country I grew up in, value systems, things like that. And coming out of that was just like fuck it. I'm doing everything I've ever wanted to do. Like, I'm just tired. I want to heal this stuff. I want to just a very big sense of I'm moving forward. And I think I told him it was healing from that. And I hadn't processed it genuinely. I kind of put it out of my head, the cancer scare. And so it was that, but should I talk about the follow-on events for the last year?
Yeah, do.
Okay. So your poor listeners are hearing about all my traumas.
It's in a healing context, but I think it's good and brave. So carry on.
Thank you. So the anxiety was hard. It was always kind of present, and the periods of depression. And one of the things that I struggled with a lot, and I don't think we've even talked this in depth, and I want to put this out there. A friend of mine struggles with what I do, and the only reason I'm able to talk about this or have gotten a diagnosis is because they were public about it. So I'm paying that forward. Because I think there are a lot of people with menstruating bodies that experience what I experience, but it turns out, so everybody, like, you leave the jungle and you have integration period, and then it was the eclipse season that summer, and I remember, two things happened. One was I went from the jungle back to the job, which was luxury retail in Manhattan. And if you can picture me, like, gesturing wildly, like, this cannot continue, and it was consumerism. It was like this everything that's kind of crumbling right now in the fashion industry, that just this sort of constant and rampant appetite, more food than anybody could eat, more clothing, it just the wave of it. And I remember coming back and experiencing this really intense disassociation with the industry, and my role in it, and not being able to find my role in it. And I kept having all of these emotional highs and lows, which is kind of part of integration. But I had a really tough period in July. One of the things that I've struggled with for about 10 years is some pretty hefty suicidal ideation. And I've done a lot of work in therapy and psychoanalysis to understand the functions of suicidal ideation. It usually, in many cases, it's, you're telling yourself, or your psyche or whatever is telling yourself that, like, we cannot persist with whatever is happening in your life. It's a cry for something to stop, not necessarily your life. But, and also, I went through this really intense period with that. And I remember thinking, I don't have cancer. And then I went to the jungle and I saw God. She's great. Like, I know that's real. Like, magic is definitely real. I saw it with my eyes. I am confirmed in every suspicion I've had about spirit, about this work, like, not even suspicion, but just, you do it and you see the effects. When you put manifestation work out there, they come back. But when you see it happen in front of you for a week, for 2 weeks straight, like, you're past the veil, right? So I was having this really intense period, or this really intense period, and really difficult night, where I almost called the suicide prevention line. And I have a wonderful apartment. I have an incredible partnership. And I was like, how can I know, I don't have cancer and God is real, and I'm still in this place? How am I still here? And I saw a friend post about Pmdd. And here's my public service announcement. Pmdd it's ramped up. PMS is not the right word, but it's a flaw. It's an endocrine disorder. It just got moved into the DSM in 2016. So all my efforts for most of my adult life to try to figure out what was wrong with me, like, it wasn't recognized. It's understudied, but it's a hypersensitivity. It's a genetic hypersensitivity to your hormonal fluctuations that happen every single month. And when I started tracking, using like a period tracker, and tracking my highs and my lows, it was like a machine was revealed during these periods that, and I remember talking to Alkistis about the utility of ovulation and the ovulation period for working with, like, creative work, and how I would get this surge of creativity, and that still happens. But then your luteal phase, which is the second portion of your menstrual cycle, I would have this crash. And I started reading about it after seeing it online. I started reading about it, and, like, you have to have 5 out of the 11 symptoms. I had 11 out of 11. I went to a doctor. We talked about it. I found out through the course of all the the cancer treatment stuff that I have fibroids in my uterus. So that complicated some kinds of treatment. A lot of women actually get hysterectomies that deal with PMDD just to make it stop. And I ended up choosing, instead of the carousel of hormonal birth control, I ended up choosing an SSRI, and I'm on a low dose, and it's completely changed my life, because what I'd been experiencing, and also PMDD, the onset is sometimes late 20s, early 30s. That's when I went to Italy. So this ramping up, and it gets worse until you hit menopause. So I have that to look forward to. But the choice some women make is either to wait it out or to again have a hysterectomy. That's early menopause, and that wipes out a possibility for kids. But it's it compromises relationships. There is like paranoid thinking, there's suspicion, like all this stuff that comes with a mood disorder. It's often misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder as well. And a lot of women, and I've talked to not just women, people with bodies that menstruate, but I've talked to a lot of my female friends about it. And when I start talking about the symptoms and the difference before and after, I've had like 3 different female friends of mine say, like, I'd like to go get checked out for this. It's still not hyper research, but there are now Harvard articles that you can read online. But it was, everybody that gets a diagnosis, you see yourself written on paper, and you're able to, like, you have that intense sense of relief and recognition that because we're taught socially that we're responsible for all of our thoughts and all of our feelings.
Yeah, that's the big deal. That's the suicidal ideation is the sort of extreme symptom, but you went to the jungle to cure or to ask ayahuasca to have like anxiety and depression and all these kind of things cured, and it has the effect. So I had a similar thing. So my version of that is there's a video in the members area for people who kind of want to see the whole thing, but there was a moment where during one of my purges, all these kind of little agreements and codes and things that were around my midsection vomited up or purged up, right? And so it was not necessarily a weight loss thing, but it was like, I don't understand after several years on keto why this is still going on. I need an inflammation solve, essentially. And so it did that, obviously, in the jungle. And again, you're like eating half a bowl of rice, so that helps. But I had a similar situation of the kind of like physical or real world self show up after the jungle. And in my case, it was like a leptin inflammation. So I found it via experimenting with the carnivore diet and all this. So now I know, because I'd done the gluten test and I'm like sensitive, but not intolerant. And I'm like, then what the fuck is going on? And it's actually another bread or grain-based protein. It's this one. I'm like, shit. And so that's gone from my life, as has the inflammation and insomnia components that go with it. And I know, just like you do in the back of your head, and I don't care what anyone else thinks, that would not have happened if I hadn't gone to the jungle.
No.
And I don't know how that works, but that would not have happened.
No, but the everything that came after, and the whole rest of the year, like I had these expectations. I want to heal these things, but I also I want to make my work. I want to start, and I felt very stalled. So all of my 39th year, like into the summer was like kind of the big panic, and then in the fall I got the diagnosis and I started on the SSRI, and then that moved us right into. I was just kind of dealing with that. And then that moved us into January when I was starting the new job. But I needed all of that time. I needed ayahuasca, there was a cancer thing, but then that was the biggest barrier, because for me, it was, it's cyclical, it's monthly and cyclical. So you have 2 weeks of generative creative possibility for making something, and then I would crash and I would be depressed and have all these symptoms. It was 2 steps forward, 3 steps back every single month, and it was constant, and it makes you feel like you're crazy because you can't move forward, you can't finish anything, you can't move forward with big projects, you doubt everything. And that shifted, that moved, that's manageable now. And I've got about 7 months under my belt now of living with it, tracking it and working with it. and I also kind of stopped drinking. There's a sensitivity for people with PMDD and PMS to alcohol, and then there's it's been explained, but like you have a propensity for anxiety afterwards, like the following day, and I couldn't manage that, and so I've shifted my recreation to other things, but that. Yeah, I'm having a new relationship with a new plant, and that's been incredible, actually, and very like ayahuasca, which has been really interesting to find out too. But but that had to happen. That had to change, because all of that was like preparatory work for what I'm doing right now, and that. What happened, like I think about a month ago, we were messaging about it, but right after quarantine happened, right after like the sort of enforced isolation, like everybody was in their homes, I noticed everyone I know that does occult work, that is magically operant, that like from the jungle, just started being really active on media, on like group chats, on Instagram, posting a lot more. Everybody started like kind of people from the psychoanalysis, the conference. It was like everybody kind of picked their heads up and was like, okay, I'm here. Like, I'm around. Can you see me? Can you see me? And like, not a lot of big conversations, but something became activated during this period. Once this had time to settle in, something became activated. And I really, really believe if all that hadn't moved these big things out of the way, there's absolutely no way I could have managed my time to do all of this. It's a string of pearls, like it always is, when you look a year or two later.
Yeah. I want to go back to the jungle because we're talking about omen logic, and we need to kind of do some of the stuff that happened to us both, and
yes.
move that into New York. But I remember the first night on the medicine, I was extremely high. Like I took a really, really high, really large dose. I did most nights, but this was my first experience with it in that sense. You had a milder first evening, and the upshot of that was that our tambos were 10, 12-minute walk, depending on how high you were, maybe a bit more, up the river. And I was still like open eye visuals everywhere. I could barely walk. So you were leading the charge in your like gumboots and with a walking stick with your little headlamp on in front of me, because I literally, I was walking, but I'd walked better. And it was funny. I could see you as a 10-year-old. So that was my first, because what it reminded me of was when you were sitting outside the Island Queen and you said, I feel like I've known you from childhood, like we grew up together in a way, but we didn't. And that was my first, like, this is going to be about that. And over the course of the sort of 2 weeks, more and more of that, at least from my experience, unveiled. And in a funny way, we did. Like, there's some kind of weird thing that happened where I was a ghost in your childhood.
Yeah.
And you're a ghost in mine. And it was this weird, it does sound crazy, let's be honest. But that was a thing. I was like, yeah, you guys have had a bunch of lives together, and it was her job, being you, in this lifetime to find you. But sometimes you find her. And that was the moment. That's why I had that. It's funny, the omen logic going backwards. Like, why would I remember how your hands moved, the kind of like shawl cape thing you were wearing at the event when you stood up and walked towards me? Why would I remember that? And then ayahuasca showed, like, see, this is you. What you're actually doing was kind of future remembering being in the jungle, but also realizing that this is a person. This is the moment she found you in this life, and it was really, really interesting to. That's what happens when you you have those kind of connections and do ayahuasca for a couple of weeks right next to someone, I think. But all of that kind of stuff unfurled where we've ended up. That's why you're my jungle wife and I'm your jungle wife.
It's because we used to date, remember?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Kind of this stupid joke I kept making. Somebody asked how we knew each other, because we were getting along, like a house on fire in the van or wherever. And it was so dumb, but I was like, oh, well, we used to date. Like, ha ha ha.
Which is confusing for people.
Yeah. Yeah, yes. And then like 2 days later, somebody else asked, and I made the same joke. And I even remember saying, like, why are you saying that? Like, that's, like there's diminishing returns of the joke. And then it was, I think, a couple of ceremonies in, but we talked in my tambo, I think a little bit about it in the jungle, or in the river. We talked a lot in the river. And I miss that.
Yes.
Yeah, I do. I think I take a bath maybe almost every night now. And I did all of my processing in the jungle sitting in that water. Like I would sit in the shallows, the kind of rapid area, and just like let it push on me like a jet stream, for hours and hours and hours. And we would talk and swim, and it just, but there was this, I don't know, like you smelled familiar, and this is going to sound insane to everybody else that wasn't out there, but like there's no washing, there's no soap, so you get real comfortable with your bodily smell. And I have zero squeamishness about like what bodies do. So I remember, like, I know his smell, like, and that was a very normal thought to have, like, on that, but it was, yeah, like always a deep sense of familiarity when I would hear your podcast, even from the beginning before we even met, and then talking and the whole way up to the dieta. And yeah, it was this is a family person, this is a repeated person.
Yeah.
And when you would talk about Fiji, when you talk about where you grew up, and I saw you, like I could see you and you could see me in the field, like we were, I don't know if this is too much information.
When I knew that we were ghosts in each other's childhoods was when you were describing the hole in the Alabama clay that you and the dog would play in. And it was really interesting because I finally understood what you were this life, because one of the things you said, because it's weird, and you explained this quite well yourself, but you're very glamorous and interested in, fashion and the beauty industry, right? But by the same token, gross and covered in mud. So you're talking about your childhood where you would dress up like and look lovely and then go and get filthy. So it wasn't even like you would throw on some old sweatpants. It's like, no, I'm going to put on a dress and I'm going to take the dog and play in the mud. And that was Katie, right?
That's about as accurate as it gets.
Yeah. And that I saw a little girl and her dog playing in like a giant red mud, like layered red mud pit, right? That and the pools of water after rain and whatever being like iridescent, and I'm like, oh, okay, so I was actually a ghost in her life, and vice versa. And there's a whole bunch of it that happened. I want to talk about sort of like the last evening ceremony, because this is the omen logic, right? This is tying it back to being why you're in Italy and what you did in Italy and the people you met and how you ended up in the jungle and all that kind of stuff. And we now have the kind of biological post-jungle component. But one of the other things that you had hoped would happen would be some after-death contact, right?
Yeah. That was woof. I was pretty shocked. I saw my dad. So I should provide some context. I don't normally talk about this stuff, but I'm saying everything else. So I'm pretty sure my dad committed suicide. I am sure, but it's not certain on paper. But
sure.
So that was difficult to work with, to work through, like moving to Italy and like grieving that specific kind of death. And there was no note, there was no, but there were indications that he was moving on. And so obviously, like he left my life, and then I left the country. I lost father and then fatherland, and grieved both. And then as much as I could, but there was no, he was cremated. So there's no grave to return to. There was no like final thing. And I very strangely, I thought I would have contact. I thought that he would show up in a dream. I had like one or two dreams that he came in, but it was like murky and not certain. And I was really surprised. That's something that I just assumed would happen. It would be clear. And the last night, and it was the same night, no, that we talked under the tree about, it was the same night that that we like found each other, and it was like, you're a soul person, like, here you are. I know you, and we used to date. And so we sat under this big tree in the moonlight. I think it was a full moon. We sat on a bench, and I had my head on your shoulder. It was really tender. And then we went back in, and I was outside again, but my body was in the Maloka, and I was under the tree that we'd been standing at. And then my dad was there, and my dad said he was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and he still had a mustache, which he didn't at the end of his life. But he kind of looked around, and he was like, this is really cool. And I was like, dude, I know, this is great, right? And I like turned around and pointed at the Maloka, and I was like, I'm in there right now. Like, I was so stoked to talk to him. I was like, I'm in there right now. Like, he was like, how is your mom? And I was like, Mom is good, but Emily needs you. And that's my sister. And he said, she needs you more. And then, right then, they called the end of ceremony, and I got pulled back. I couldn't stay. It was just a really brief exchange. But while I was talking to my dad, my body was holding hands with you and sobbing uncontrollably.
Yeah.
And then no, please.
Creepiest, like, thank you for sharing. It was the creepiest, like, omen logic stuff, right? So I finished the stuff that I finished my work early that night. Mm-hmm. And I was still out of it, but I knew that was going on, and I knew my part in it was to provide the physical component to the conversation. And it was amazing, right? So I finished all my ayahuasca work early, and I'm like, why did this happen? I like this stuff, right? I'm like, oh shit, it's this. And it was one of those, because the previous ceremonies, like, you were like deeply possessed at one point. Like, I came in the bathroom one of the nights, and your eyes were, you looked like a snake. You actually had become snake, right? Mm-hmm. We were joking about it, but so generally speaking, and this is just good psychedelic hygiene for everyone, no touching. Everyone goes through their own stuff. That's what it's for, right? And that's not just ayahuasca. That's how you should be doing these things when you take them seriously. And so I broke the no touching rule in the last of the evening ceremonies, and it was because I felt compelled to do, like, I'm supposed to do this, right? And so it was really, really interesting. And then, and this is the kind of weird, pleasing turnabout, because you'd done such an extreme amount of processing. That was our last evening ceremony. We did have other ones, but I walked you home, and you walked me home the first night, because I'd done all that kind of stuff, and you'd done it then. And I remember you said on the first night, don't worry, because I'm like, thanks for this. And like, don't worry, one of these nights you walk me home. And mm-hmm. I did. And so it was a kind of unusual capstone on like a really, really profound experience. And it's that kind of omen logic stuff that I hope is interesting to everyone else. I'm enjoying talking about. It was really, because I was talking to him, and then all of a sudden I got pulled back, and it was like I kind of came to, and I was like, oh, I'm weeping, and I'm holding hands with Gordon, and I like opened my eyes, and you were watching me or looking at me, and I think you said, like, you okay? And I was like, I was talking to my dad, and you were like, yeah, I know. Yeah.
And then I just like broke, and you were like, all right, let's get you home. And, you mothered me, and I deeply appreciative. But yeah, it was very, like, we've had, like, there was another parallel. Yeah, I don't know. That was the last kind of thing that I expected from ayahuasca, but it was not to that, no. Not that level of intensity.
And I noticed that you earned it. So I got some, obviously I went for, like everyone else did, physical things and spiritual things and what have you. But I processed and healed from some traumas that I was not expecting to process and heal from, to do with like the fire, which so last year for me obviously was deeply traumatic, and I basically had PTSD from the fire without kind of really realizing. And I didn't go to work on that. I mean, I did to some extent, but ayahuasca, after a series of, she'll give you the things that you came to have fixed, and then because there's more time, it's like, oh, this, right? And then in that weird cosmic way, it will turn out to relate to the original concern as it is. But it's funny, like that just seemed, even the next day, normal. But by that point in the dieta, it's like, oh yeah, Katie had some like interactions with her deceased father last night, and everyone just talks about what happened, and it's good, it's healthy. I've retained that. I talk about this stuff as normal because it is normal, but that was a remarkable kind of odd in a good way. Just things that happen that are normal in that situation, where people would get, because everyone knows that you sort of get the same kind of visions, like ayahuasca's presentations are fairly conserved across cultures, so that she sort of looks the same wherever you encounter her. And part of that, people would have fragments of each other's journey or similar ones, and that was just, I think it's a good story to tell.
Yeah, I remember too, like the whole week I was starting to get a bit jealous because everybody was having these like receiving information or tasks, or like, that like, oh, I have to, write this book or start this business. And I was waiting for my thing, and I was just getting possessed. Like I was just like it was just hours of me sitting in the back seat and having my body moved and getting downloads of information and lessons, but not in the way that I've talked to some people where they felt really clear, this is how I solve this problem, or this is the next thing that I'm supposed to do, or this is the work I'm meant to bring into the world. I was flailing around, and it was incredible. And I actually, I can't wait to be possessed again, to be really honest. That's not a joke. That was unbelievable. But then like that, that came on the last day. And then it really has been the unfolding of the last year that it's like, oh, okay. Like it was this, it had to be this, and it had to happen over the course of months, with the mental health stuff. And it's more biological than mental health, but yeah.
Well, I think that's why you got possessed, because I think ayahuasca is like, all right, roll up the sleeves, here we go. I think there were some very specific things on a body and embodied basis that you, like the fastest and quickest way to do it is what she did. And a lot of the possession, a lot of the lessons that I got were around the womb. Were around like some deeply feminine stuff for me, but also, I mean, that's where the lymph node was removed, was the groin. So it was a lot around that. So much energy was concentrated around that part of the body, and healing and lessons about that. And I actually, during the last ceremony, I saw a lot of the eating of cancer cells, and like dissipation of like moving through the body and getting into little dark corners and like cleaning things out. So one of the things that hatched as a plot in the jungle was the Guggenheim event that I did with Diana Walsh-Pasuka last year in New York, where of course you live, and you participated. We'll probably have some images. I've still got some images of the garment. So we're going to talk about ritual garments again, but first there's like one little coda to our strange association, I guess, which was, I got to New York early because we had all these plans that you rudely abandoned me to my own happy devices in New York, but stuff kept coming up. Like I had this whole week, we were going to be doing shit and whatever, and that didn't happen. And I was very deliberately and lovingly teasing of you about how you could do that, to the point that like there was no time. So we kind of saw each other briefly. It was all work stuff. So it was make sure this fits, and then I saw you at the event, and that was basically it. Except, and this is what's weird about us, right? So we had a plan to do a whole week, not like, but like see each other multiple times. You're going to invite me around for dinner, all this stuff you rudely didn't do. And then I flew to Portland because that's where the event with Austin was immediately afterwards. And who was at the airport that morning going to LA. Well, if it wasn't
right.
Jungle Wife. Now, so we didn't get any time together in New York, but because I think we're both flying Alaska and they have the Wi-Fi thing, we crossed the country talking on WhatsApp. And I'm like, this is weird, but this is us, right?
Yes.
So we had this plan of, like, this is kind of what our whole connection is, because it's supposed to be one thing and then it ends up the other, and because our planes left at the same time, that was like 4 hours. It was 4 hours.
Yeah, no, it was, I think your plane was literally, we were parallel. We had to have been almost exactly parallel for a while, and then you veered north.
Yeah.
But we were, and we weren't looking at the same, like exact same landscape, but we were over the exact parts of the country at the same time, talking via WhatsApp. And I think, we had coffee?
Yeah, we did. So I couldn't get you into the lounge, but because of that, I just brought you coffee out.
Yeah, that's right. And and then you.
I wanted to hang out with you at an extended period of time in New York, and our version of that, because we do things weird most lifetimes, but definitely this one, is we did in fact get to have an extended conversation. It's just it was on WhatsApp in the sky. It wasn't in person in New York. And out of all the people, this is the kind of omen logic stuff that happens with us and with ayahuasca. It is deeply improbable that we would have been at the airport on the same day for two very, very different reasons, same morning, same airline, leaving at the same time to talk on WhatsApp using the in-flight Wi-Fi. It's just ridiculous.
Oh man, Lima was fun.
Oh, wasn't it? We went to the Witches' Market.
Yeah. I still have the Santa Muerte. I can't get it to whistle properly, but I probably shouldn't be trying. I think maybe I don't tempt fate. That was the Guggenheim thing. I made ritual garments for that. And a lot of the time.
Took us, because that was really cool. That was because this is where you're going business-wise. It's one of the reasons we wanted to have this chat for ages. But where you're going from like a business and project is in this kind of co-created custom ritual wear. And so talk people through. I've got the images of it. We look very. Doesn't matter. You'll see it in the post, everyone. But talk us through what's going on with mine.
So a big part of why we ended up not hanging out before, and I kept telling you I'll explain later, and a lot of it was early September, September 10th. And so that was maybe a week after I'd gotten a diagnosis and started getting on the medicine. So I was in a really tender spot in terms of anxiety. And I tend to manage that by just not communicating because that's healthy. And, but it was also, I was deep into construction for those pieces. And I never ended up posting anything about them, but yours, because I knew that there was a component that had come to me at a really early stage. I was like, there's something in the way that I'm constructing this. It felt really putting it together. First of all, I mean, we had one fitting, but we didn't do anything. Like I made the garment, brought it to you, and it fit perfectly. And I made it for you while you were in Australia and I was in New York. And it's because I had the opportunity to read your body in the jungle, which I do all the time. Like I'm always looking at people's bodies, and I know that's weird, but like, if I don't say anything, they can't tell. It was for the event, and you have for your aesthetic, you do some pretty next level power clashing.
Oh yeah.
That I really love. And I went through
the hats, but like I've been doing 90s invisibles since the 90s, and I will not stop.
But I went and I got suits, all suits made from that were made in Italy, suit jackets. So all different kinds of fine Italian wool, different weights, pretty close to the same weight. And you wanted an incorporation of an Astaroth sigil in the garment. and I worked it into the garment in such a way that you were wearing it on your head and on your shoulders for the entire talk at the Guggenheim. So it was, and it's essentially a pentagram, but it was sitting around, your head was through the center, and it was sitting, the pentagram was sort of draped on your shoulders, but it was inside of the garment. And I'm not going to say more than that.
Yeah.
But
and it's not visible, and you'll see it now. It's my Astaroth lab coat, because I obviously took it with me through my multiple other destinations, but it's still here now. It's at the edge of the world.
Yes, that's, I mean, I couldn't want more than that. And I had a sense then when I was making it, it was something open where I was like, I had to read about Astaroth. I had to work with her, work with the timing that we were working with, think about you, pull in all of this, just all these different threads kind of pull together into a single garment that was used for that event, but that you could take forward with you in time. And a lot of the interior is a patchwork and of different flowers, like different materials, different printed materials. The outside, I think it took like 10 different suit jackets in Italian wool to cut down. But there was a seed in that made me so excited that, and this is the part of a part of the business, maybe the most emotionally fulfilling part that I'm looking forward to for this business is, and Hello Membership, I'm talking to you specifically. I want to make more of these ritual garments that incorporate materials, place, ancestral heritage pieces, timings, and different schools of bring me all your gods and your stuff, and I'll put it in a garment, essentially. There's a compression of energy that happens when you have a uniform for an item, right? So like if you do all of your farm work in the same thing, in the same jumpsuit or same piece of clothing every single day, it's why workwear is so beautiful as it ages, because it has the mark of time, it has the patina of sweat, it has your enzymes in it. In no other way, or in a way that may be a tool, but not even. These things take you on as you place your body into them, these garments, not even ritual garments, but, if you are constantly doing yard work, or you're constantly, if I wear the same thing when I sew, or the same thing when you go on stage, like you're imbuing that garment with the energy of the activity, with your very specific experiences that you're having, especially with performance. And it's why I've really liked making costuming. I made a garment for Alkistis, and then she wore it twice. Like it was a tighter weave the first time, and I opened it for the second time. But Alkistis is now in that garment. The sweat from her enzymes are in that garment, but the lessons of why she was dancing, of each Budo dance, are in that garment, and also her emotional progress, the journey that she went through while she was in it. Like, because I'm not articulating
No,
this
it's
well,
good. I'm hanging on every word. Go on.
Yeah. You walk onto stage, one person, and you stage as an example, but you go through these movements, this experience, in front of an audience or on the farm or whatever, and you go home different. You go through an emotional evolution. And if you commit a garment to that garment carries all that energy with you. And it can be anything. It can be a t-shirt. It can be like you, for instance, dip it. If there's a body of water on your property, you dip that garment in the water, you bring water in and boil it, and then put the shirt in that. Now that shirt is of your land, is of your place. And you can take that with you when you go to London. There's an easement that that these kind of ritual garments, I find, provide. And they so intensely aid in manifestation work, because you're in constant alignment. Your body, your physical body, is in contact with this thing that is carrying your work with you, that is carrying your essence with you, your sweat, you can bring your place. Like I have every time I travel, I go to a vintage store, a thrift store or something. I buy something from everywhere I go. It could be like a piece of jewelry, a shirt, a jacket, and I'm really, really picky. But it's the same reason when we got to Lima, it was winter, and I only brought jungle clothes, and I was cold, and we were walking around, and there was a shop, and you were like, go in there and buy a jacket. And I'm like, no, I'm going to find, Lima has 5 vintage stores, thrift stores, essentially. I went to all of them in the couple days that we were there. And I brought things home with me. And that I now have a piece of Lima. I have a piece of a garment that somebody wore from another life of that place. I have a marker of how economies moved, how, like, by visiting vintage stores and thrift stores, when you go to other places, you're also seeing who was buying clothing, how much they were spending, and sort of like what secondhand markets are giving you clues about firsthand markets from 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So if you're seeing really nice clothing from the 60s or 70s, then that market had money, right? So, but you bring that with you, and you're bringing that place with you and that history with you, all of it. And it's all in a thing, and it's in a thing that you can take, and because clothing is so accessible and democratic in this way, you can take it anywhere. It's available to anyone. You can wear it you bring it with you every day.
This is what I love about your kind of like language of ritual garments, right? Because typically in a magical context, when people say ritual wear or ritual garments, they're thinking very Solomonic grimoire of, and it's not that there isn't a place for this, but like white bleached linen, no smells, nothing, because you're supposed to be cleansed and what have you for those very specific operations. But that's just those specific operations. In the same way, I wouldn't wear, speaking of operations, I wouldn't wear my Astaroth lab coat to perform surgery. Like this isn't the right thing. But the language, and we were talking about it before we hit the record as well, like the material you work with for ritual garments already has a story. It's that that idea of objects as persons, and that this is ritual language that is closer to the masks we were talking about earlier in the episode. So it's built of you and spirit and context, and definitely that will not be a replacement for the white Solomonic robe, but it is it's like a language of witchcraft rather than like precision Solomonic ritual, I guess.
Yeah, it was nice when I sort of found, when I developed this, process sounds so intentional. It definitely didn't happen that way, but I found a place to put all of my ability to complicate the system, to complicate any system, and this very more is more aesthetic. So like the dress that I made for Zola Jesus, for example, it was linen that I got when I lived in Italy, and the place that I got it from, well, first of all, the military base in Italy is in a defunct prison, a defunct Italian prison. And so I bought a bunch of linen sheets from nearby there. And I noticed, I gave a piece to Charlotte, and she was, she said, Charlotte Rogers, she said, there are numbers embroidered on this, and it's a twin size. Like this probably came from an orphanage. And I remember looking at it and I was like, oh, fuck, these are prison sheets. These are vintage Italian prison sheets. These are sheets that people slept on. And then it was just like shoved in a warehouse, and I ended up with some of it. And that's what I made the dress from. So that's there, that sense of confinement, that sense of solitude, that sense of, a longing for connection. And in some way, by taking that sheet that this, a person probably slept on, cried on, and like felt longing on, and I give it to a performer who performs in front of an audience, then energetically that person is coming forward and they are experiencing all of the connection of a group of people who were all in that moment, experiencing love and wonder and excitement. And I hope, I mean, I think in some way it travels forwards and backwards, right? So it heals that person, because it can smash time in that way.
Yeah.
But that's one element. I mean, like, there were, I don't know, tons of other parts of that garment, but yeah, it's intensely, it's so powerful to me.
That's a reminder. When we were in the dieta, you mentioned Zola Jesus, and I hadn't heard anyone speak about her before. I go, I fucking love Zola Jesus, and she's like, yeah, we're friends. I'm friends with Nika, and I'm like, oh, that's so fucking. That's how Nika ended up on the show, of course. But I love that piece. We have to make sure, like, if you're listening to this, it's definitely in the show notes. But this is just like a reminder for Katie.
I'll send it, I promise.
It's such a good example of almost coming back to what's the difference between costume and ritual wear. Like, language and meaning is not confined to magic. So if you are playing with how, and it's again, it's people viewing you, it's perspectivism. If you are confidently using language of representation to kind of constitute yourself in different settings, you are doing magic, right? And there's the extra level to it of like, well, why not do that on a magically operant basis as well, which is like, okay, well then that's true enough, but also what happens if I put like Asteros sigils in?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, like a really fun and teachable process for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much disconnect because of the fashion industry with how we align ourselves with our bodies, and how we sort of like develop a sense of identity. I really have a lot of dislike. I don't know anybody that has a lot of like for the fashion industry. It's my medium that I work in, but it's the same thing as Nika developing a separate streaming, or it's not streaming platform, but a separate, God, what was it? The music platform that she built out in the beginning of like the first week or two.
Yeah. Like the sharing discovery platform for it's brilliant. Like, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like you know, like you can use this, you can be a musician and not like the music industry. And it's similar. But you know, like it's the power that garments have to create and shape our boundaries. Like the garment will essentially designate self from other, right? And if you're working with manifestation work, and the idea is to, even if you're thinking about something on the lines of like law of attraction, you want to pull things towards you. And as Mitch said recently, I don't know if you quoted this or something in like one of the last podcasts, it's all kind of running together, but it finds you most often through the path of least resistance. You know, like when you're doing manifestation work or sigil work or something, a lot of times, like you keep those paths open because, you know, if you're looking for grants and you do work around the grant and then the grant gets accepted, then I mean that's still magic. It's still happening. It did not happen because it you know didn't fall out of the sky, but because garments have such a power to designate ourself, they provide an incredible editor and an incredible it attracts and repels it's like a first line editor, like a tender bio or something. Like it keeps people you don't want from you, and it pulls in people that you do, and you're already having these conversations with your garments anyway. So working intensely in alignment with your outward appearance with your garments and intentionality every day, that if you're doing a period where you're maybe working on like a Tending Miracle Challenge or like a manifestation, like sigil work or something, and if you are dressing, because it's a thing you will do every day, it is deeply mundane and quotidian. If you are adding in that layer of intentionality to dressing, to moving through the world, it's such a powerful tool to assist. It just amplifies sort of everything else that you're doing. It can.
That's a good example, right? Because it's not just the assisting, it also accumulates. So you have
Yes.
a ritual garment of some description that you put on for a 10-day miracle challenge, which then manifests. That garment is now, it's done that, right? So it's brought stuff into it, but it's also done it. This is why I think the language of it is, we're not talking ritual garments. And there are people out there who can do this, and it's great, that will make the grimoire robes, but this is magical objects. This is that kind of language. And so tell people, again, we're doing this somewhat out of sequence around the launch of the website, but if people want to do this as a consult, what does it look like? Where do they go? How does this happen? If they want to do the thing I did.
It is, so I took my mother's maiden name. It is lo-monte.com. So I've brought my ancestors with me under this whole endeavor, because I very recently changed my name back to my father's name post-divorce. So now I've got everybody with me all the time. But it's the consultation is essentially, there are two parts. One, I'm going to sell vintage. I've been traveling and collecting and buying vintage for 20 years, and it's, I'm setting that up. But the other is I really, really, really believe in and love assisting every kind of body to be represented well and to feel comfortable. And that was a big part of my job at the boutique for the last 3 years in Manhattan, is dressing people. And there are a few things that I love more than dressing people. Pattern makers and designers, they don't know your body. Patterns are based on averages that change every year. And not patterns, mannequins. And then, patterns are based off of fit models, and, there's still a lot of body discrimination and racial discrimination in how patterns are based. So short story long, I've worked with a couple of people now, taking garments that they're no longer wearing from their wardrobes and remaking them into new garments. So there's a rework portion, and that can look like anything. Then there's the ritual portion, and that's, if any kind of timing, if you want to work with, I can sew every other Saturday. If your chart is ruled by, you have a Saturn ruled chart, there's anything that is important to you, any system, if it's religious, if it's spiritual, if it's animist, if you have handkerchiefs from your grandmother, if it's physical, we can find a way to incorporate it into a garment. And a personalized ritual garment is an amplification tool. And that's it. And it doesn't it can look however, it can be as fancy and fantastical or as simple as possible. But to your point about, after you've done the miracle challenge, the garment has done that. You wear something, a shirt, same shirt, jacket, to perform a ritual. And now that jacket has been a part of it, and it amplifies as you continue to do it. So, that's it.
Look, it was a great process, and we did it across the world, right? So I got James did it, but we did the measurements here. I haven't had something fit my tiny, ridiculous shoulders quite so well. So if you guys get in touch with Katie, you end up with an amazing product at the end of it, and it's sweet. Because at the moment we can't really go anywhere, so it's not. No. Now is actually the absolute right time to be able to do this kind of stuff.
And I like how much this period is flattening things for people and pulling this kind of connection, because it's just mailing things back and forth and talking, talking over the internet. And
it feels like the right kind of real. I'm into it.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, Jungle Wife.
Jungle Wife.
Yeah, I think we killed it. I think this was a really, really good chat. And in a funny way of these things, I'm not surprised it's on an anniversary, because we had to move it a couple of times and so on, because that's how we roll. But
it's true.
Yeah. So the website again?
Monte, lo-monte, MONTE.com.
And you kind of fly under the radar on the Twitters, but do you want to give people any of that other stuff as well?
Yeah, I am. I have another website. I do fly under the radar. It's ktmrtn.com. That's got my like the shoot with Melanie Gatos and then some other pieces I've made. Nika's dress is there. Twitter, I think I took off my phone. I haven't been on there, but it's the same for Instagram too. ktmrtn at on Instagram, and that's where my stuff is. But please, like I want to meet everybody. Just
Get in touch.
Get in touch.
All right. Yeah. Thank you once again. This will be in the show notes as well as images and all the rest of it. And yeah, good chat.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
We didn't plan it like this. In fact, Katie and I mentioned that early on, but this has turned out to definitely be kind of like the exact right show for our times. And not just because human interactions have been legally restricted, although it is that conversation too, but it is that conversation in the wider context of what a more haunted, holistic healing looks like. Think of it like this. Good medicine doesn't grow in bad metaphysics. So recentering the imaginal, recentering the universe as a living place moves you out of that industrial Rockefeller vision of the human as some squishy machine with parts that can be replaced. There's no physical healing without emotional or psychological healing, and vice versa in kind of a medicine that grows out of good metaphysics. And when you take that about as far as it can go, such as a full dieta, you also get all these strange time effects and foreshadowings and presages and connections that have that eerie logic of omens. And that's the same language and same logic that underpins ritual garments, come to think of it. So we know from archaeology and anthropology that body coverings, be they permanent or temporary like clothing and masks, are crucial components of semantic signaling in spirit-based systems. This survives in fragmentary form, admittedly, in folklore or folk magic. So think of concealing psalms or other pieces of scripture in one's clothing, or certain flowers, tucking those things or sewing them into a lapel or what have you. That sort of thing. And the sky really is the limit when you scale that up to a full language of communicating and relating in a living universe. So anyway, much food for thought from this fun chat. Check out the show notes for links to Katie's pieces, as well as where to find her. And yeah, stay sane out there. Until next time.